Hey everybody, and welcome to the next installment in my Dorico series on page formatting for parts and scores. Today we're going to be looking at the layout options under the library menu in Dorico. Now I know it might seem frivolous to do an entire video just on one menu in Dorico, but I'm here to tell you there are so many important things in the layout menu, and I change these for literally every single document in all of my parts. Because every score is a little bit different, every part is a little bit different, it is so terribly important that we go through this menu and we understand it really well because, in all seriousness, this is the menu that I will change almost every single time. And I almost don't have a template or a default for this one because no matter what, when I change the piece, different notation, time signatures, all of these things, it really changes what I need out of the document. So I'm going to be running you through some of the most important elements in the layout menu. I think it's wonderful to take notes during this video and make a little list of the ones that you're going to change a lot, because there's a few of them that are a little hard to find. And so once you know where they are, it's so great to be able to just go there right away, change them per the document you're working on, and you're ready to go for the next one. So here we are with the layout options in Dorico Pro. Now the layout options here in Dorico are massive. We have a number of categories on the side, and there are some of these that I don't change very frequently, but I really want to highlight the ones that I think are worth looking at, and so you know where the options are. Now, do bear in mind as we're going through this, if you want to save a default for any of these, you can, but do understand because of the nature of notation, a musical score will have different requirements than an orchestral score, than a concert band score. So you may end up, after saving a default, realize that the thing that keeps coming up is not something you really want all the time, but it might be the best that we can work with. So under the bar options, this is one of the options that I really like to add to most of my music nowadays, because in rehearsal, whether you're working with pros or a student group, it's great to be able to say, can we start at measure 36? And the measure numbers are there for everyone. So here on the top, we have this frequency where we can show bar numbers every system, every n bars, aka every 5, 10, whatever number we set, every bar or none. And in the score, I like to put bar numbers under the bottom stave of my score, and I like to have them on every single bar so I can very quickly tell the players, hey, let's start at, and then we can quickly get there. We have some horizontal positioning, which we can be left aligned with the bar line, we can be center aligned with the bar line, or we can be floating in the middle of the measure. Now, I go back and forth on this, and it kind of depends on the score. Oftentimes for the score, I actually like to do it centered on the bar because I think it's a little visually nicer because I have that little bit of extra white space on the bottom line there. Speaking of that, we also have the placement. You can do it above the top line of your score, or you could do it under the bottom. And in this particular case, you can also choose which instruments in your score you'd like them to also be added to. Now, I find this to be somewhat distracting, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this on for a second and just kind of show you what it would look like if I put it in more than one spot. You can see now I have bar numbers floating above the bari sax part, a trombone part, as well as underneath my drum part. Now, again, I don't necessarily like having the clutter because the numbers look distracting to me there. So I don't typically turn that option on by default. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those and just leave it at the bottom stave. Now here on the bottom, we have the minimum distance, aka how far underneath that bottom staff do we want it to be. And then also there is this place relative to dynamics. And what this means is, do you want Dorico to try and put it up inside of your crescendo around that, or do you want it to just push it down below all of that stuff? I also like to turn on the avoid collisions so that it'll push it out of the way. The last option you have here is you can also align them across your bottom system. So right now, if I was to come out of my score, you'll see that here where the lyric is, the bar number jumps down to the bottom underneath the lyrics to avoid that collision, but here where the lyrics aren't being used, they jump back up to that minimum spacing. A lot of times I like to turn it on to have it aligned across the system because I think it looks nice to have it uniform all the way across. Finally, we have appearance, where we can choose the paragraph style. So for example, if I wanted to make them huge, I could choose the title paragraph style, and now you'll see my bar numbers became gigantic. If you want to customize the paragraph style for your bar numbers, remember that's under library and paragraph styles, and then you can go down to your bar numbers for your score or parts, they are separate, and then you can set what you would like it to be. 9 might have been a little small, so I could turn that up to 11. And then if I go back to my layout options, I can go ahead and choose this back to my bar numbers for score. And I'm also going to put them inside of an enclosure, aka there's going to be a little circle around each number. And see, now you can see the bar numbers are very bold. They stand out really easily so I can see them. And it's definitely something where I can look down quickly, see that number, and know exactly where we're at in the score. Now, the brackets and braces oftentimes are set by the template we choose in Dorico, but if you started with a blank score, you may have to go in and add in your brackets and braces. Now, this is just a quick shortcut to allow us to very quickly say, hey, do we want to use standard orchestral bracing, small ensemble, wind band, big band, or the British brass band? It's a really quick set where we can just group our instruments very quickly to get those nice braces. I think braces and brackets look really good in the music, and so I'm a big fan of adding them in. So the next category down in the layout options is the chord symbols and chord diagrams. Now this is a pretty small one unless you're working with chord diagrams, but there is one hidden feature here I'd like to point out because some people accidentally check this on and then get frustrated because they can't turn it off, which is this option to enable chord symbols above the top system in your score or part. If you turn this on, you will not be able to make those chords disappear. And so if you're finding that you can't figure out why you can't make the trumpet part to stop having chord symbols, it could be that you have engaged this option. There's also another one of those kind of hidden gem options. Some people like on piano parts to have the chord symbols between the left hand and the right hand, and this is how we would do that, between staves or above the top stave. Now, I like them above the top stave, but if you want them in the middle, that's where that setting is. On the bottom here, we have options for our chord diagrams. Now, I don't do a lot of guitar-specific books. I don't typically make chord diagram charts for my compositions, nor do I put them in my scores. So I don't monkey with this one a whole lot, but it's here if you need it. The next column down is for movie scoring, aka markers and time code. So if you're creating a movie score for a conductor to use while they're playing to video, this is where you can add all of that information into your score. Now, one option I do touch a lot is the note spacing. This is one of the most powerful tools in Dorico in terms of saving yourself white space, aka reducing the number of pages in your part. There's a little bit of a concept here that I want to explain. The first one is the default space for a crotchet or quarter note in your music. And what this means is how much distance is there between beat 1 and beat 2 in a standard bar. Now, this applies to kind of whatever your primary beat is. So if you were in 9/8 or 12/8, it's still going to think of that as your quarter note, even though it's a dotted quarter note. So basically, the way to think of it is these are the primary beats. And as this number gets smaller, you can see in this graphic, what it's doing is it's pulling the beats closer together, which is always a really unique and interesting way of measuring this. And so in a piece of music, say a middle school band chart, where you really have nothing but quarter notes and half notes, you can really reduce the width of a bar by lowering this beat spacing because there's not going to be a whole lot of built-in collisions because we're only dealing with the larger beats. So if I was to apply this to my score, you can see I pulled an entire measure back onto the first page because I've reduced so much of my spacing down. Now, the second category is the minimum space for short notes. And what this means is if you were to leave this at its default, which I believe is at 1 1/4, you'll see that in the graphic, as the default spacing of our quarter notes gets smaller, it starts to crush together our short notes. So, what I typically find that I will do is I will go ahead and I will reduce this sum. I think the default in Dorico is about 4 for its spacing, and I'll do somewhere between 4 and 3. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 3.5. And then I typically will raise my short note spacing to somewhere around 2 to ensure that if I do have 16th notes, it will spread the music out properly. And I find now everything looks pretty well spaced, but you can see I still pulled an entire measure back onto page 1. And over the course of an entire document, this might save you a page or two, depending on how many pages you have. Below that, we have the scale factor for grace notes and Q notes, so you can decide how big or small you want them to be. You also have this option for make space for lyrics. And all this means is in vocal music, like I'm looking at down here, it ensures that the lyrics will spread out the music no matter what the note spacing is, which is obviously very important. And then finally, one of the best secret options here is the only justify final system in a flow when it is more than 75% full. What does this mean? Well, let's go to the end of my document. Now, here on this last page, you can see that I have the full width of the page. But if I was to get rid of this system break, you'll see that the last line no longer actually pulls itself over to the end. It goes as far as it needs to and stops. Now, on the score, that doesn't bug people, but when we go to a part, some people find this to look very interesting, and they don't really like that look where there's that partial bar hanging on the end. But if we go back to the layout options, and if I was to go under my note spacing, and then I was to uncheck this box, it will force the last line of the part to spread out to be the full width. So the next place that I go all the time in Dorico is the page setup, and the page setup is quite large. So bear with me, I'm going to try and scoot through this one pretty quickly. So the first thing you're met with under page size is the literal page size. This is where we can tell any score or part how big we want it to be. So if you wanted a full size 8.5 by 11 score, but then you wanted the parts to be marching band folio, again, you can choose this for each part or score. You can also choose a custom sized part down here where you could just make this bigger if you were doing some sort of custom project where you wanted it to be gigantic like a banner, then you could tell Dorico how big you want it to be. This is also where we choose portrait versus landscape for our scorer parts. The next one down, you've seen me use this in other videos, but is our rastral size. Now remember, the rastral size is the size of the space inside of our staves, and that affects the size of anything in Dorico. We also have this option here to choose which page template set you want to use. Now, I'm going to be speaking about this in another video, so I'm going to come back to it. Now, one of the ones that I do change fairly frequently, again, to try and help make my documents fit better, is this page margins. Now, remember, we have the same, meaning every page is identical. We have different, meaning we can make the left page and the right page radically different. Like, let's say we wanted to have a songbook that had pictures on the left page all the time, so we could custom make it so that there was this extra space there so that we could fit things in. And finally, we have mirrored. Mirrored is pretty common, especially when you're thinking about binding music, because that way we can put the same kind of spacing we need on the inside of both the left page, which would be the right edge, and the right page, which would be the left edge, so that they would be mirrored of each other. So when you open the book, it looks uniform. Another underrated one is this music frame margin. Now, this is how much padding is put on the bottom and the top of each of your musical frames, which are the blue boxes in your score or part. Now, the next segment really only applies if you're working on a multi-movement work or something like a fake book or a collection where you have multiple different songs, which is the flows option. What the flows do is if you had a multi-movement work, this is going to tell Dorico, hey, when we go from movement 1 to movement 2, do we want it to start on the same page or a different page? Do we want to use the first page template for every single movement or just the first movement and then everyone else just gets the default? So if I turn this on, you're going to see that it's going to push my music down and it's going to put in the flow title. Those titles can be set under the setup menu. It's this bottom area here. So if I was to change this to big band, you will see that after I make that change, it will reflect in the score. There's one final option here that I think is kind of cool, and it's a little bit sneaky, which is this fill frames with blank staves. Old fake books used to just have blank staves underneath the music. So let's say you had a lead sheet that was only 3 lines, and then Dorico will go ahead and fill the rest of your page with blank staves. Now, some people would find this useless, but if you were creating an educational document and you wanted to have music on the top and then space for students to work underneath it, this would be a way for Dorico to automatically create those. If I go to my trombone part here, where I have blank space on page 2, if I go under that page setup and flows, and then I turn on that fill with blank staves, you'll see now the rest of the music has blank staves, and it can have the clefs either disabled or enabled. And so now on the bottom of your music, you could literally have space for people to write notes or make little adjustments if they need to. Another really important one, although I don't change it frequently, is the Players tab. Here we can do a transposing versus a concert score by unchecking this box. We can also use custom player order. Sometimes when I create a mini score in a piece where I want to see like just first alto, second alto, and piano part, for example, this will allow me to order them in whatever order I want. So in my score, I had the vocalist on the very bottom, but in my piano voice part, I actually wanted to put the voice on the top. And so I did a custom player order, you can see there. Down here is another really powerful feature in Dorico that I'll speak about in a later video, but this is where Dorico will automatically insert instrument changes. And what this means is, if you were to work in your score in the galley view, if you have a player that has more than one instrument, you'll see 2 different lines, one for each instrument. And that way, when you put music in one instrument and then move down your score and put music in the other instrument, Dorico will automatically condense those together to make one seamless part, and it will label them for you. It is so accurate, and it is really powerful, and let me tell you, this is a humongous time saver. There's also the option here to show instrument change at the beginning of a flow. So again, if you were doing a musical theater piece and you wanted the player to know that, hey, at the beginning of this next piece, you're on flute, that way it'll display that right there at the beginning so that they know what part they're going to play. This next segment, again, it's not very commonly used, but if you wanted to have a score that had blank space for, say, again, students to write answers and stuff, there is this option to show bar rests in empty bars. So if I uncheck this, you'll see over here in my score, all of those default hole rests that were filling measures are now gone. So the last few items here in the player setting are not things you'll probably use all that often, but we do have one of the more important options here in Dorico, which is the percussion notation options. Now, I've done this in another video on percussion notation that you can check out, but this is where we can choose whether we want to see the traditional 5-line stave, the grid, or the single instruments. Now, this is kind of a big topic, but just remember the difference between the 5-line stave and the single instruments. If I was to choose single instruments, you'll see that my drum set part now is exploded to being every single instrument available in this percussion kit. So under your setup, when you make your percussion kit, this is how these parts will be displayed. You also have the option to enable tablature if you're doing guitar. If I enable this, you'll see that it adds adds a tab staff, and it auto-populates it with the fingerings that should be there for standard tab fingerings. Another option that I think gets people sometimes is you can uncheck show cues and show fingerings. Now, I like cues on all the time in all of my parts because how am I going to know there's a cue unless it's printed there? And finally, we have harp pedaling, figured bass. They're options. If you need them, they're there. And then finally, we have the condensing. Condensing is where Dorico is going to crush all of the like instruments together into a single line. So some older scores used to do the thing where horn 1 and horn 2 were on one line and 3 and 4 were on another line. And so if you enable condensing, Dorico will actually take and it will crush your score down, and it will show you all the parts with the up and down stems, and it's a great way of making a condensed score. Now, I don't typically do this on big band scores, but for a really big piece like an orchestra or something where you have lots and lots of parts, this can be really handy. And again, it's automatic and it does a really good job. When you're under the condensing, you can exclude certain instruments from being condensed. So if you had a part where I really always need to see second trumpet because of XYZ, you can go ahead and you can tell it to condense. And you can also tell it to, when you go into divisi, instead of doing the stem up, stem down thing, it'll actually break them into separate lines. All right, another important one is the staves and systems. Now, this first couple of options, I don't typically change very much, but you can see here, there is the staff labels on first system where I have full, which is the full name. Abbreviated, you can see, would now be A sax versus being alto sax. One of the ones, though, Dorico does by default, it'll hide instrument names on future lines, which I don't want because I really do want to look down quickly and say, that's bass trombone. And so you can see in my score, if I was to turn off the staff labels, on the subsequent pages, you can't tell which stave is which. We have a few more options here for labeling, but I'll be honest with you, I rarely ever change these. The only one that I use sometimes, which is this option for show player group labels. And what this is, if you had a mixed band score, for example, where you had a flute, a trumpet, and an alto sax playing part 1, and then a different group of instruments playing part 2, you may want to turn these on. So I have group labels set in my setup menu, and you can see when I enable it, now I have saxes and trumpets, trombones, and so I can actually label the groups of instruments if it wasn't already obvious. You can also set a custom name for your player. So over in your setup tab, if you had put a custom name on your player, like say Woodwind 1, and you wanted that to display in the score instead of the literal instrument name, that's where you can choose that over here. Now, by default, Dorico names the players the name of the instrument, so the two match up, but you can change them in the setup menu, and that's where we can correct this or alter it if we need to. This pitch and transposition, I don't use a whole heck of a lot, but this is one of those places where if you don't like it to say trumpet in B flat, you want it to just say trumpet, you can go ahead and uncheck that option. The next segment is one that for some people really is a helpful tool. For me, I think it really is distracting, but is the concept of a cutaway. What cutaways are is it will literally remove any measure that is blank from the score, but it will not condense the score. So if I enable this, you'll see now anywhere that no one is playing, it's just kind of blank paper space. Now, this was a really popular notational standard many, many years ago, and they were kind of trying to save paper space. But I don't think it always works, and sometimes I think it's a little bit distracting. So typically, I don't turn this one on, but it is here if you need it, especially if you're trying to do something like a cadenza section and you want to get some of those empty staves out of the way. We do have our Osayas menu. I don't do a whole lot of Osayas in my music, but if you need them, they are here. We also have the system divider, so if you had more than one system On a page, say on a condensed score piano part, we can have it go ahead and show those dividers. Now again, another one of those features that's kind of hidden, but is this concept of casting off. What this means is if you want to set a specific number of measures per line, a specific number of lines per page, or if you want to allow a really long, complicated bar to get split from one line to the next line, that's where these options can be set. So I typically find that because of the auto collision features in Dorico, these can be kind of problematic. But if you were creating, for example, a songbook where you wanted to have a uniform number of lines per page and you really wanted to have 4 measures per line, this is where you can set that. And it definitely has its place. One of the nice features in this, though, contrary to like the way Finale used to do this, if you do set this to a fixed number of measures per line, you can go ahead and push one measure back up into the previous line, and then Dorico will just reflow the rest of the music. So if you had a 1 measure second ending, you wanted to push that measure up so that the next line started at the new phrase, it'll go ahead and reflow your music for you. So that's a really handy feature in Dorico. The fixed number of lines per frame, I don't use this one very often at all because I find it to be really complicated to figure out exactly how many lines I want because of the spacing of the music. But you can see there is this option here to scale number of systems by the frame height. If you wanted to have ideally have 10, but on the first page the frame is a little small, it'll go ahead and maybe only put 8 there because that's really all that fits. Another really important feature here under the staves and systems is this system attached items. This is a really powerful tool in Dorico. This allows us to tell where we want to see certain items displayed in the score. Now, our system attached items we can see under this menu where it says specific players. We have time signatures, system texts, that's that Shift Option X on Dorico, or under the right menu, system text, tempo, rehearsal marks, repeats, and horizontal lines. Now, if I wanted to see the tempo marking, say, at the voice part and on the top, and then I wanted to see rehearsal markers at every instrument grouping, and then let's say I wanted to see the repeats at both the top and the very, very bottom, if I enable this, you'll see that it now put my tempo marking down here at the bottom as well as the top. It also has my rehearsal markers here, 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 and here. Again, another good example is in a busy score like a musical theater score where you might have really big blocks of cues, you might want those text items to be on the top, and so you're going to put your rehearsal markers on a lower stave to keep the two from colliding together. Do note that once you enable this specific player, if you don't check a box in that column, those things go away. So if I uncheck my tempo, you can see I no longer have a tempo marking on the top or the bottom of my stave. And that applies to all of them. And so do be aware that if you are going to enable that specific player setting, you're going to have to choose something for pretty much all of those options. And finally, we have repeat markers. So if you have codas symbols and DSL codas, you can have them above and below or just below, as well as you can see word wrapping for repeat markers too. The tempo option is pretty darn easy. All this is do you want to see the quarter note equal in the parts? Well, if you don't, you can uncheck that box. Under the time signatures, this is where we're given the option to customize the time signature. We can go with the individual or we can go with the large time signatures. This is kind of in vogue right now, especially for conducting scores, so the conductor can actually see the time signature, because let me tell you, as somebody whose eyesight is not great, I oftentimes cannot see those. You also can choose from these options of regular size, narrow without the serifs, those are those little lines on the bottom of the letters, and then you have the plain font. And then finally, we have the vertical spacing. Now, I talked about this a lot in my staff spacing and my system spacing videos, so you can go back and watch those to get a better handle on these. But I do want to make mention in this video about your staff visibility. If you want to hide the left hand of the piano because it's totally empty and no one's playing, this is where we can do it. And again, you need to check things like allow individual staves of a multi-stave instrument, aka left hand of the piano, to be hidden. And so this is a way of doing that. Now, I know that was a huge amount of stuff, but I have to tell you how important this menu is. Again, I change this for every single one of my documents, and I go into this menu so often because the piano part is different than the bass part, which is different than the sax part, which is different than the violin part. So I make changes to this all the time. It's a great idea to take notes and make sure you know where those settings are that you need to get to all the time until you get them locked in to where you could find them without ever trying. Thanks so much for watching this video. In the next installment, I'm going to be talking about the page templates and how to fix the title blocks and everything else in your Dorico parts and projects. It's a really specific system that Dorico set up that actually is incredibly powerful, but you really do have to do it the way Dorico wants you to, or you can cause a whole bunch of different little things. If you're enjoying the content, please like and subscribe. I got up over my 10,000 subscribers, which is amazing, so I'm working on my next 10,000, so here's to 20K. If you're looking for some new music, check out my new album, Singularity, and I will catch you next time.